If you are ready to start your own backyard orchard, you are in for a treat because there's nothing better than fresh fruit grown from home. I've grown up on a farm my entire life, and some of my best childhood memories are out in the orchard picking fresh fruit with my grandpa. And I'm so excited because today we have an incredible guest, Josh Gardens, and he is joining us to give you some really great tips on getting started with fruit trees. So, Josh, welcome to the Audrey's Little Farm Show. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thanks, Audrey. Great to be here. Super excited to talk all about fruit trees and what it means to you and your audience.
Thank you. Also, to start off, can you just give us a quick introduction of how you got into growing fruits and what your online business is about, and just, a little bit of everything going on for you?
Sure, yeah. I got into fruit, I guess when I was a kid. My mom was a gardener and I spent a lot of time out there, and we would go to those you pick orchards where you'd go pick your own cherries or pick your own apples. And I remember as a kid, I'd be like, one for me to eat, one for the basket, and so I just loved being outside as a kid. And later in life, after working in IT for my day job, I'm behind a computer screen all the time. I'm like, I got to get outside. I really want to get back to nature. I moved out onto some property here in South Carolina, and I've got some acreage, but we really only cleared like a small part of it. And thought, okay, I'll start planting stuff. This will be easy, right? And this was 10 years ago. And so I started with a few fruit trees, got a few more. It's like, this is fun. This is so much fun. And then all of a sudden, it's like, where else can I squeeze a fruit tree in? Like, let me get as many as I can put in. And then I got into citrus trees in containers. And so it sort of emerged into this thing where I had so many, I was selling them. I was like giving them to friends and helping them put in fruit trees. And eventually I was like, maybe I could share what I've learned over the last 10 years with other people. So I thought, hey, social media looks pretty neat. Let's look into that. So about a year ago, I started posting on social media just to see how would this go? What do people think? And people really like it. And it's been so much fun hearing their feedback and their questions, and sort of feeds into other content. So that's the long and short of it for me.
Nice. I love that. It's like just gardening in general. It kind of usually starts off as like a hobby, but then it kind of becomes like this addiction of adding all the different varieties in. And I feel like being in the online space and teaching about gardening, there isn't that many people out there teaching about fruit trees. And so it's really cool that you found your niche teaching on fruits because that's not as common.
Yeah, there's not very much, and what's out there is just sort of very sparse. There's not something that's like start to finish. It's like focuses on one thing. So I'm trying to just give everything that I've learned out there in the universe. And one of the resources that I learned early on was Dave Wilson Nursery. They've got some really good resources online, and just a bunch of books and things that I read that really helped me, as well as just tons of online research trying to figure out like, okay, how do I do this? How do I plan that? But backyard orchard culture is very different than commercial orchard culture. I mean,
Yes.
and when I visited commercial orchards recently, they're all about like spacing for machinery, efficiency for fertilization rates, spray programs. I mean, it's extremely different concept.
Right. What would be fun is before we get into some of your tips, how many fruit trees do you currently have growing in your backyard orchard?
I sort of feel embarrassed to say the number, I'll be honest. I I probably have over 200 trees, maybe 250
Oh my
total.
goodness. And you said how many acres?
I've only got like 7 acres, but I that's really on a couple acres. And a lot of those, now granted, a lot of those are in containers, some are really small. I've got them planted throughout the woods, on fence lines, all different types. But yeah, I've got about 2 dozen, maybe 25 citrus trees that I've grown in containers. And then I roll them in on these carts into my garage in the winter. So
That's awesome.
that's been really fun.
That is awesome. Well, it just is also such a great um, inspiration for anybody listening who thinks they don't have space to grow fruit trees. I think that's a really common misconception. So I'm super excited to dive in. So let's start off with first off, just I know we're going to dive into some specifics, but will you just start off maybe with a couple of the most important things that people need to know before planting fruit trees? Just what comes to mind as the most important thing to know?
Absolutely. The first and most important thing is you need to grow what you like to eat. So don't be like, oh, that's a cool tree. And then you're like, oh, I really don't like pears. You want to invest in the things that you know are going to pay off in the end for you and your family. So start with what you like to grow and eat. and then think about where you want to plant. Sort of map out your space. And when you're doing that, you need to really focus on full sun or as much sun as you can get because more sun means more fruit. And I can't emphasize that enough because I've planted in a lot of really shady places and it's significant. I won't get fruit on places that are under 4 hours of shade. You just won't get enough photosynthesis to be able to create those flowers, which are going to create the fruit. So pick what you like to eat, plant in full sun. And I would say the third thing for anybody looking to get into it is really understand your soil. Like get to know like what's your planting soil like? How does it drain in that spot? What kind of soil is it? What's the conditions? Okay, and then I'm gonna add a fourth thing because
Yeah.
why not? Is you need to understand your culture in terms of the climate. So the climate is so important because I tried to grow things that just don't work well here. I haven't had a lot of luck with almond trees, other types of trees that just aren't really made for my region. So you need to understand like what are the types of fruits, like raspberries, for example. It's just too hot. They just don't like really warm temperatures in the southeast where I'm at. And so you need to understand, okay, this is going to be easy to grow, and this one's really hard, and I may not get anything, and it may die. So why put your energy into that to begin with?
Right. Those are such great tips. A couple things were just coming to mind because I teach more on the vegetable growing side, and it's like there's a lot of things you could do to manipulate vegetables because they're just an annual. You plant them in the spring and you get rid of them in the fall, or vice versa. And you can cover some things up with shade. You can maybe make them a little bit warmer with a greenhouse cover. But with a fruit tree, it stays in the ground for a really long time. So, and it takes a while to get fruit, so you don't want to waste your time on growing in an area that's not going to be productive or like you said, growing a variety that's not actually going to do well in your climate. And so those are all really great tips. I know right now at the time of recording this, we are in October, which is actually heading into the perfect time of the year to start planting fruit trees. So what in your experience is the best time of year for beginners to start planting?
That's a great question, and it depends on where you live. So, what I always like to say is if you're south of the Mason-Dixon line or you're in a more warm climate, then fall is a great time to plant because the ground's not going to freeze. You're going to give the most amount of time between when you plant and when that tree is going to succumb to stress through heat and drought in the summertime. And so, the longer period you have between that time, the better. Now, if you're in a cold climate, you're north of the Mason-Dixon line, which is really that Maryland, Pennsylvania border, if you're not familiar with the East Coast, or if you're in the mountains, right? If you're on the West Coast, and you've got that colder climate, you want to wait till the ground thaws and plant in late winter, early spring, and that's going to be the best because then you're not stressing your tree out by putting it in the ground in the fall where the ground's going to freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw, and that freeze thaw cycle really reduces the chance of it surviving through that very first winter. So I say cold climates, spring, warm climates, fall.
Perfect. That is super helpful. And for we'll mention this again at the end, but any of you guys who are listening, Josh is going to be one of the speakers this coming year in February at the Spring Gardening Summit, and he's going to be teaching about growing fruit trees. So, being that it'll be in late February, if you haven't planted yet, at that point in time, you'll still have time. So you'll get to learn a little bit more later on during the Spring Summit. Josh will be one of our speakers. Okay, so next step, after, they figure out what time of year to plant, what are the different types of trees? So there's grafted trees, seedling trees. What are the differences between those and which type should you go with?
A lot of people think they can just go to the grocery store, cut open a fruit, save that little seed, start it in a little cup of soil, and you can do that, but you're going to be waiting years. I mean, no exaggeration. It might be 10 to 15 years before you get fruit from that when that tiny seed gets big enough. And that's because grafted trees really accelerate the process. So I recommend to people only buy grafted trees unless you know that it's already mature or close to being mature, or you're really patient, right? Or maybe you want to plant a lot and you're not worried about time. But if 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years for grafted versus seedlings, which can be 5 to 15 years, that's a big difference. So the difference there is that the way that grafting works, for those that don't know, is it takes a rootstock from one type of apple tree, for example, that's grown for its hardiness in the ground, and then it's grafted, meaning they cut the top of it off and they put scion wood, which is the named variety, on top, and that is like your favorite Gala apple or Fuji or whatever type Honeycrisp. And that's the variety that grows above. And the benefit is the rootstock is really good for certain disease resistance, and the top is really good for fruit. So you get fruit quicker, you get fruit that's going to taste better, and you get a rootstock that's more resilient to that environment.
Nice. That is super interesting. And to my understanding, there are certain varieties that will not grow if they are not grafted, correct? Or if it's not that cross. I might be saying this wrong, but um, don't you have to then, like, for example, if you there are certain fruits that if you were to just plant the seed and wait for it to grow, it would never produce fruit?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So for example, persimmons, that's a good example. In native persimmons or American persimmons, they come in male and female. Um, and so what happens is you don't know what that little seed's going to be. You could plant five seeds, they could be all males, and none of them will produce fruit, and you could have waited 10 years. Grafted trees are oftentimes either self-fertile or which gender it is, so that you know, okay, I need a male kiwi, for example, and then I've got three female kiwis, and that way this one is pollinating those three. So that's another reason, correct, to get grafted.
I will say, for anybody listening who's interested in trees, sometimes I feel like the whole world of growing fruit trees feels a little bit intimidating, but the best time to plant a tree is, like they say, what is it? Plant 20 years
20 years
ago, and the
ago.
next best time
Yeah.
is today. And it's so true because we used to have so many fruit trees growing up, and a lot of them got pushed out, and now my family farms walnuts. But I just started doing more of my own backyard orchard trees again, and so I have some nectarines and peaches and pears and apples, and I'm starting to add more things back in. And I kept thinking about it every year for a few years, and then finally this last winter we put them in. And I just kept thinking like, oh, if I would have just done that 5 years ago and I wanted to, I'd be getting pretty good harvest by now. But I waited and I waited. um, but at least they're in the ground.
Yeah, no, it's a long-term investment. And what I recommend to people is that, like, oh, I had a kid, I don't have time to wait 5, 7 years. Well, get a couple fruits that will fruit quickly, and then get some fruits that are going to take a while so that you get something sooner. And then you've also got something that you're investing on for the long term.
Right. And then actually that would be a great thing maybe to lead into is what would be some quicker maturing fruits that people could plant to get a quicker harvest from, and then like you said, some that are going to take a few more years, but they'll be worth it in the long while.
Great question. Figs are probably one of the quickest. In fact, you might buy a fig from a garden center that has figs on the tree already. Yeah.
Oh
In
wow.
fact, I saw one the other day. I was like, hey, this has fig. I was eating figs. Don't tell Lowe's this, but I was like, oh, let me taste this fig that's ripe right on this little tree here. And, you know, that's the quickest. Mulberries is another one that grows like 8 foot in a year. So that's a really good one to plant. That's quick. Some citrus, container citrus, you can get fruit quickly. Now you're not going to get very much, and they're going to be more slower growing, but you could get them earlier if you're growing them in containers.
Okay, super good to know. Is there anything about like, for example, this I planted the apple tree, all the trees I had just listed off, the apples, pears, etc. And then I got a few apples this year, but they just didn't really taste very good. Is that first year of fruit not as good because that tree's still immature? Is there
Yes.
something to be said
Yeah.
about that? Okay.
Yeah, I think it takes a couple years for them to produce large fruit. I had a similar experience on my apple trees where I had one, and I think too, like with apples, it's all about the timing of when you pick it.
Okay.
So a lot of times people will pick apples early. That's a mistake that I made, was I pick it like, oh, this is just so starchy. It doesn't have much like sweetness to it. And you really have to wait until they're like just the right amount of sweetness. And there's different ways you can tell that, but I have a problem with squirrels here, so I'm like, I got to get those apples before the squirrels do, and then I end up with apples that don't taste as sweet.
Right. Okay. And I think that's it's one of those things too where it's like, especially if your tree only has a few on there and then you pick them too early, well then you got to wait till next year to learn from that mistake. So that was probably I think I was probably more in that situation of picking a little bit too early, but we had such a hot summer. The apples were just like looking kind of fried anyways, and I thought, man, if I wait any longer, they're probably going to be bad. So I picked them, but I'll know better for next year.
Well, the funny thing is that pears are sort of the opposite. You want to pick pears, especially European pears, off the tree before they're ripe because they actually ripen from the inside out. So if you go grab a pear that's mushy, it's already rotten on the tree.
Oh.
So you need to pick it a week or two before it's completely ripe and then sit it on your counter and counter ripen it at least for a week. And then it's
Okay.
like the perfect, like mushy sweetness without being, you know, overly rotten, basically.
Okay. That's like such a great tip to know, which there's so many different fruits and I like grew up with all these fruits, but it was, it was commercial. Like we had crews coming in to pick everything. So it's like I never paid attention to all those steps that went into it. And I feel like for your channel and site, that would be a great product or something that you could create is like a harvesting guide of when to pick all the different fruits. Because
Like
I
that.
think that's something that a lot of people wouldn't know. I had no idea about the pear.
I learned that one the hard way, like many things in life.
Okay, so now when it comes time, so we've, got the right time of year to plant the different types of trees. When it comes time to actually planting the tree, do you have some tips?
I have a lot of tips for planting. How much time do you have?
Oh, we've got all day.
I'll keep it simple. There's really two types of trees that you're going to buy, and that's going to be bare root trees, meaning that there's no soil on the roots, and the tree's dormant, or potted trees, which means that it has roots in soil, and usually that's when the tree is not dormant, meaning it's flush with leaves. And so it sort of depends on which way you go. But in either case, here's some really core principles that I tell people. You need to make sure that the hole is not deep, but is wide. Because if you dig your hole too deep, that tree is going to sink down. It's going to cause a lot of problems. And if you dig a wider hole, that's going to loosen up that soil and let those roots go out, which is what it wants to do to really get stability and nutrients as quick as possible. So if it were up to me, I would dig a 10-foot wide hole if I could for every tree, but obviously that takes a lot of work. But it's going to give your tree the most amount of success, the more wide that you're willing to dig the hole and loosen. It's really about compacted soil and decompacting that soil to allow those roots easier movement outward. So that's a big one. The other thing on planting, a lot of people think, oh, I should fertilize at the time of planting, but that's really not recommended. You can get like salt buildup around the roots. In fact, that's one of the things I don't know if I told you this, but I'm going through my get my master gardener's certification here in South Carolina, and my teacher was talking about that. He's like, "No, don't put fertilizer in the roots; builds up salts." And I was like, "Oh, that's why." Okay, and so that was one of the lessons: is don't fertilize at the time of planting. You fertilize the next growing season. And then lastly, I would say probably watering it in regularly. The most risk to a young fruit tree is it drying out within that first year. So if you water weekly, you'll be safe. Unless you get like an inch of rain or it's really heavy rain. But a lot of times, even like lighter rain won't penetrate down to the root zone. So just keeping it moist the first year consistently is going to give you a lot more success.
Okay, that's really good to know. When it comes to watering, do you have your trees on a drip line, or do you do each one with a hose that you let it run, or how do you water all the trees that you have?
I started out with a drip line and I had this huge 250-foot line and all these things, and I'd go check every one. And then I sort of got to the point where I was like, that is just so much work to keep up with all of that. And I found a couple ways to sort of hack the watering process to where I don't have to water as much. But for that first year, I'm still having to hand water the newly planted trees. But once they're established, a lot of my trees I really don't need to water unless they're fruiting and it's drought, just because of how have conditioned the soil and also how I've mulched and how like where they're planted. So there's a lot of techniques there. I wish I had. I mean, obviously, drip irrigation is what commercial growers do, and that's the best case scenario to get consistent water. But there are other ways around it in a home orchard environment.
Okay, super good to know. One of the things that we did because we had such a hot summer this last year, so I set them up on a drip line like right away, just because I knew if I didn't, I wouldn't be out there every day when it was 100 plus degrees watering by hand. So tips for anybody listening, if you're in a similar climate where you have really hot summers, it'd probably be your best bet to get something automated set up from the beginning, just so that you don't risk letting your young trees go without water for too long of a period of time.
Exactly. And I have had trees die because of that. And I've seen that firsthand where it's like, oh, I didn't water that tree the first year. It was way out in this area that's so far away. I was like, oh, it'll be fine. Sort of forgot about it.
Yeah.
Didn't make it. And honestly, I was like, yeah, I should have known. That's an
Yeah.
easy way for it to die.
Well, especially, when you plant when it's cooler outside, you don't think, in 6 months from now it's going to be hot again and it's not going to be enjoyable. So,
Yeah.
that's one of the things I try to teach about all the time is even just with the vegetable garden is getting it set up on irrigation and a timer if possible, just so that when it is hot and not enjoyable, at least everything's getting water.
Okay.
Will you go over some pollination requirements for fruit trees?
Sure, yeah. So every fruit tree category is a little bit different in this area. Generally speaking, you're going to have more fruit when you have multiple varieties of the same type of tree, whether they're self-fertile or not. But generally speaking, you need to just do your research by the type of tree. So apples are probably one of the most complicated when it comes to pollination. There's like different timing of when the flowers open. There's like sterile, like versus not. So apples, do your research. Pears, plums, peaches, they're a little bit more forgiving. You can just look up pollination partners. I mean, the key is knowing, okay, first of all, does this require a pollinator, right? Um, and a lot of them will say self-fruitful, and that's fine, and you can plant that, but you will get bigger and better tasting fruit if you have a pollination partner with it. So citrus is probably one exception to that rule. Most citrus are self-fertile, and a lot of times you'll get less seeds if you don't have other pollinators, which is something interesting that I learned as well. But yeah, do your research. When it comes to things like muscadines, there's also, male and female or kiwis. There's a lot of trees that do require a tree that might not produce fruit at all, just to pollinate the ones that will. So just keep that in mind too, that in certain situations you might need that.
Right. And when you're saying this for someone who, isn't, who might still be a little bit confused on this, when you say two different trees, when it comes to like a peach, for example, you don't want two of the same variety. You would want two separate varieties of peaches, correct?
Correct. And that's because every Alberta peach comes from the same Alberta peach, meaning like it's genetically the same tree. So you're literally putting like two of the same trees right there. So when you get an Alberta peach and a Red Haven peach, well, those are genetically different. And that's what makes it cross-pollinate. Same thing for pawpaws, same thing for a lot of different things where people are like, oh, I got two of the same types. I'm like, well, that's not really going to help you when it comes to pollination.
Right. That's one of the helpful things from buying from a local or buying from a nursery with people that understand the fruit growing world. Because sometimes you go to somewhere like Lowe's or a Home Depot or some kind of garden center like that, and they don't necessarily have the workers that understand the pollination that goes behind fruits. That is one tip I have for everybody is if you're going to go buy fruit trees and you're not quite sure, if you have a local nursery, it's really nice to talk to somebody who understands that world.
Absolutely. And
And
when
what
in
I
doubt,
found is
just buy more trees.
yes. When it comes to all the trees that you have grown, do you have, I'm sure that the list is probably more than just a few, but do you have a few of your favorites that are your all-time favorite fruits, whether it be taste or, production, whatever it might be, but
It's a really tough question. So I did bring one tree in here, and this is my new favorite. This is called a loquat tree. I don't know
oh
if you've heard
yeah.
of loquats,
Hmm.
and they're evergreen. I don't know if I can sort of show you here, but it's got these big, huge leaves, and they're really bushy. They only grow in like zone 8 and warmer, but they produce these orange apricot looking fruits. And so I just did a video on it. It's a very unique subtropical tree. So it would be great for California, probably, especially along the coastline there.
Yeah.
Um, that's one. And then another one I brought with me here, which a lot of people may not have heard of, and that's called a pineapple guava. And
Oh,
so these are little like egg-shaped fruits, and they're actually best when they fall off the tree. It's an evergreen shrub. And so it's got these beautifully glossy green leaves, and I literally have two 8-foot shrubs, and I'll get 1,000 of these between the two. No joke. I will
wow.
literally get that much fruit off of them. And then you cut them down the middle, and they've got this like gelatinous goo, but it tastes just like pineapple. No joke. It's pretty cool.
Oh, wow. And what was the name of that?
That's a pineapple guava.
Okay. And what climates does that do best in?
Same sort of thing. 8 to 10 is probably the zone for that.
Okay.
So those are fun, like tropical fruits. If you're in like a colder climate, I really like some of the small like bush cherries, like Nanking bush cherry and some other like colder, more hardy. Obviously, there's all the usual apples, pears, peaches, plums. I like to get in some of the more abnormal stuff, like pawpaws, persimmons. Those are things that really excite me because not a lot of people have heard of them.
Right. It's cool too. Well, I feel like living here in the Central Valley, we live really right in the middle of citrus, so everyone in this area is pretty familiar with citrus, but anyone, even people that are local, haven't necessarily tried an orange right off the tree. And it's like nothing compared to a store orange. Even if you pick it, 2 days, if I picked it 2 days ago and ate it today, it still doesn't taste as good as when you pick it right off the tree. And so I think that's the biggest distinction between fresh fruits, really, no matter what variety, but especially citrus. I feel like it's like the taste is just so much better when you pick it right off the tree. And
It's huge. I could not agree more. And when I first tried my Awari Satsuma Mandarin orange, I peeled it and I was like, okay, it just looks like a normal mandarin. I ate it. And it was like the sweetest thing I've ever eaten. I mean, I've never had anything in the grocery store taste
yeah,
even close to it. Yeah.
yeah. I think that's like the biggest treat of, growing your own fruit is the taste just right off the tree is just like nothing that you could ever get. Even at a farmer's market that was picked maybe yesterday. It's just like so much better when you could pick it fresh. And
Just like homegrown veggies. I'm sure you know that,
yeah,
eating a homegrown tomato versus store-bought tomato.
yeah, it's like there's just no comparison.
Mhm.
It's funny too, because you almost get spoiled when you're used to the good taste of something fresh, like a fresh tomato or a fresh orange. I don't even buy them throughout the year at the store just because the taste is just so different. It's not even something that I enjoy, but when I can have it fresh, it's one of my favorite things. Besides fruit trees, do you have any other, do you grow berries or any other types of fruits other than just trees?
Yeah, I've got blackberries, thornless blackberries, some kiwis. I've got a lot of like bush fruits like blueberries, strawberries, not so much. Strawberries are sort of tough here. You really got to be like dedicated for the cause. Um, let's see, what else do I have? I mean, obviously the pineapple guava is sort of a bush fruit. Obviously all the ground fruits, things like melons. Trying to think what else. There was one really funny melon, jelly melon. It's like a horned melon. I grew that. It grew like a cantaloupe. Um, but it was like really spiky. It was pretty pretty unique looking. So
Yeah.
I do all different types. Um, I'm really getting into like different types of grapes. So muscadines around here, but also some table grapes that do well in the southeast. We struggle with a lot of what's called Pierce disease. So like your normal like wine table grapes are sort of tough to grow here because of the humidity and things like that. So muscadines do a lot better.
Okay. That reminded me of something as you talked about the diseases. Is there any practices that you put in place throughout the year to help prevent different diseases with your trees and just pest problems, all the things that come along with growing? Is there anything that you do to prevent that and like treat it if it happens?
That's probably like the number one question I get is like, oh, how do I protect my tree from XYZ or this? What do I do? I've got these spots on this thing. And there's a thousand different problems that you can have. But honestly, keeping a healthy tree that's well fertilized, well watered, mulched, and pruned, I can't emphasize that enough, is going to prevent so many diseases because when trees are really dense in their growth, they're not pruned properly to be open habit, like what happens is like the air is sort of stagnant inside the tree and that creates a lot more fungal issues and different things that'll spread. So pruning is a huge part of tree health and a lot of people don't know that. They just think, oh, you prune, for the shape or prune to reduce the amount of fruit, but pruning helps keep the tree healthy through airflow and sunlight getting into all areas of the tree. So outside of that, you sort of have to spray or do things specific to the type of issues. If it's Japanese beetles, there's one thing. If it's, rust, if it's another thing. If it's gummosis, that's another thing. And we could talk all day about the thousand little things and then use this product for this and do that spray for the, but keeping a healthy tree prevents a lot of those issues.
When do you, I'm sure this probably varies depending on the type of fruit, but when is the time to prune?
So I get that's the second most often question I get. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. I mean, you can prune any time if it's one of the four Ds, which is dead, diseased, disoriented, or damaged branches. So, in fact, I just pruned some of my plum trees that had these water sprouts that were like straight up. So, you can do that anytime, but most people prune in the winter. And the reason for that is because it's the least, it's usually drier, it's the least amount of disease that'll come into the wounds. The tree is in a dormant state, so all that energy is in that root area versus in the tree itself, so you have less risk. Um, so I do about half of my pruning in the winter, and then I do the other half in the summer. And summer is really more for this tree is getting so big, it's getting out of hand, and I need to control its growth. And what a lot of people don't realize, and this is like one of the mindsets that home growers often fall into is they're like, oh, I'm so scared of pruning my tree. I'm just going to clip a little bit here, a little bit there. Like you can take drastic action. In fact, I keep all my fruit trees to 8 foot or less, and I cut them down to that every summer. And if I didn't do that, all my trees would be 15 feet tall. I wouldn't be able to reach the fruit. So
Right.
you can control the size of your tree through pruning, and you can do that in usually summer or winter, sort of the two most common. A lot of times pruning in fall is not advised because it could shoot out new growth that'll die back from freeze. But yeah, that would be my
Okay.
recommendation.
And will you explain when you're planting, this was something that if anyone has followed me along on my Audrey's Little Farm YouTube channel, I have a video of planting all the bare root trees that I planted this last year with my grandpa, and we talked about how you cut down the tree at the time of planting to prevent that 15-foot tree from the start. And if you miss that point, you're kind of it's you're kind of too late because you can't really prevent that later on. You have to cut that tree back, but it seems intimidating and a little bit scary to cut it back as low as you do. But can you explain that process? Because you're going to explain it better than I do.
Sure, sure. And I did watch some of your video. That was great with your grandpa planting all those trees. That was
Yeah.
so cool to have him like giving you advice on
Oh
stuff. Like
yeah.
I wish I had like a grandpa to be like, no, don't do that. Cut that here.
It was actually really fun because I called him. I was getting ready to plant and I had a couple questions and he was like, "Well, you don't do that on your own. I need to come out and help you." And I'm like, "Okay, perfect." And then I told him, I'm like, "Well, you're going to be on YouTube." And he goes, "Well, I'm not talking." And I'm like, "Yes, you will. You got to give some tips." And it was really fun.
He knew what he was talking about. I
Yeah,
was
well, he's been in
impressed.
farming his whole life, so I'll put that video in the description for anybody wondering.
Yeah, that was a good one. So back to your question. So it's called heading, right? It's a heading cut when you take off the head of the tree. And it is probably the most overlooked part of planting a tree. People just put it in. They're like, okay, that's good. It's perfect. Why not just do? But a lot of times you need to cut back a third or half of the tree off. And so what I do is I recommend people get a smaller tree. A lot of people think, well, get a bigger tree, you'll get fruit quicker, but it's actually better to get the right structure for your tree earlier when they're younger. So I try not to buy trees that are thicker than my thumb, is sort of like my rule of thumb. Um, and the reason for that is because you're going to have buds lower on the trunk so that when you do make that heading cut, it's going to push out new support branches. And again, this, like you said, it helps keep that tree shorter by establishing what are called primary support branches lower on the tree. There's a great book that I read. Hold on one second.
Yeah.
That talks all about this. And I cannot, if you want to have small fruit trees, this is a little book by Anne Ralph. And it really helped me learn like how to prune my trees to keep them small. I have no affiliation with this book. It just helped me when it comes to pruning. And it's all about, I mean, literally knee high and sometimes lower than knee high. Like if you want a really short tree, and you can do that if you start when the tree is young. If the tree's too old, you sort of missed your window. You got to cut it higher.
Right. Well, that was one of the issues we actually ran into when we were planting these trees. Is a lot of them were bare root trees that I got at the nursery. They're perfect size, like you talked about, younger trees, and they had the buds down low, and we were able to do that really low cut. But I had bought some apple trees that were actually, they were growing and they had been in the pot for a while. They weren't bare root, and we couldn't really cut those back very low because there was just no buds down low. And that's one of the other things I wanted to point out for anyone listening is even if this sounds a little bit confusing, if you look up some videos or like Josh said, there's this book on how to grow little fruit trees. Um, if you do this yourself, but you cut and there's no bud below that cut, then you're not going to get that low branch, and that's bad. And so you have to know to look for those buds. That's what you called it, right? You have to find those buds where the branches will branch out. Um,
Correct.
And there was a few of the trees that we had planted that didn't have that. If I would have known that before going to the nursery, I would have probably picked different trees also. But I just kind of picked and I was like, oh, this one looks good. This one looks good. And I didn't think much of it until I got them. And my grandpa was like, well, these don't look very good. And so anyway, so yeah, something to, a few of these things are important to know prior to even buying the tree. And then once you get them home, doing that process correctly makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. And a lot of times you can see the size of the tree when you order, even if it's like an internet order, it'll say, oh, this is a 4.5 foot tree and it's got a 3/4 inch to an inch caliper, right? But some of them might say, oh, it's a 5 to 6 foot tree and it's got an 1.25 inch caliper, which means how thick that trunk is. Well, that's probably going to be a little bit too thick to achieve that. Those low support branches, which might be okay if you want to like run your mower under the tree, but you might need a ladder too if you want to be able to pick it.
Yeah, one of the cool things that I didn't really realize till after planting our own trees is we still have 4 rows of apricots, peaches, nectarines that are still like the commercial trees that used to be out here on the ranch. And in my mind, just like by looking at them, because the trees are so old and they're so big as far as like they're tall, but the actual trunk is super low because when they planted those trees years ago, they did that heading cut. Was that the correct term, heading cut?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and
exactly.
so it's like when you actually look at the base of that tree where the branches start up, it's such a low cut, and it shows like how important that was way back then. Even though these trees have grown tall, they could potentially be pruned back to be manageable to pick fruit from. And you just kind of glance, you think, oh, they didn't do that back then, but they did, and it's like harvesting. When the crews come in, it makes harvesting just easier for everybody, but especially for the home gardener. Like you don't want a tree that you have to get a ladder for.
Exactly. And you'll see that most common if you go out to like a peach orchard or any stone fruit orchard. I
Hmm.
mean, it might be only a foot off the ground, and then you've got these huge, thick trunks coming out in this open vase shape, and you
Yeah.
can just literally walk up and like fruit all along that whole branch real low.
Yeah, Josh, I'm looking at my notes. We have covered so many great topics. I think this gives everybody like such a good start on starting with fruit trees. But I know you have some really good resources for people to continue learning. So will you let everybody know where they can connect with you? Um, where to find you and all these links. I'll be sure to put them in the description for anyone listening or watching on YouTube.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. You can go to unclejoshgardens.com. That's one of my ebooks on portable orchards. So if you want to grow in containers, maybe you don't have a big space and you want to just grow in containers, bring them inside in the winter, or even leave them outside. That's an option. So that's one ebook. I've also got all my social media. I go by the Plant Techie is my handle. So the Plant Techie. I know that's sort of hard for some people to spell, but basically, I'm on all the social media platforms, and I've got a couple different ebooks, some checklists, things like that. But I did also release my course recently, which was part of the Fall Vegetable Gardening Summit, and that's been really popular amongst a lot of people. And just getting started with fruit trees. So maybe you haven't planted one before. You're like, I don't even know how to dig the hole. I don't know what to put in the hole. What do I put on top? How often do I water? It answers all those questions in just sort of a start to finish process, step-by-step guide. So that's something else that I've got out there right now.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Those are just some really incredible resources for everyone to check out, and I'll be sure to link to everything. And also everyone who's listening, first, check out Josh's Instagram. The course that he just mentioned is incredible. I went through it. He was a speaker for this for the Fall Vegetable Gardening Summit, and now we're getting ready to host that summit again this coming February of 2025. And he'll be speaking on growing trees in small spaces. So I think that's a really common topic for a lot of listeners is they don't have tons and tons of space to grow, but there's tips for that. So Josh's talk is going to be all about growing fruit trees in small spaces. So you can join us for the February summit. I will put a link below if you guys want to join the wait list for that. But if not, just continue following along with Audrey's Little Farm, and all the links for the summit will be shared as that event gets closer. And then in the meantime, check out Josh's Instagram and course and all the resources mentioned. And Josh, just thank you again so much for this incredible talk. It was really helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you for this time. And you had some great questions, and you know what you're doing too. So keep going.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Okay.